Hi. Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to another player profile video on Bass Lessons Melbourne. I'm joined today by my very good friend and incredible bass player, PW Farrell. Thanks for coming down, Pat.
It's PW Farrell's pleasure.
Also known as Patrick.
Patrick Farrell.
The unit.
Patio Furniture.
Patio Furniture. It's been a while.
I know, man. It's been like 3 years.
Yeah.
Why did this happen to us?
I guess I moved continents.
You did move continents a bunch of times.
Yeah.
And I was incontinent.
Anyway, how about we start off?
Yeah.
Telling us about your musical background.
Okay, so I've been very lucky. My first instrument was piano. I started when I was 5 years old. And I never really practiced what they told me to practice, so I just went and sat in a room and bashed the piano. I made sick beats.
5 years old though, that's pretty early.
Yeah, for making sick beats. And then, I mean, music always took a very second place to rugby. I was a little rugby player. But I always loved music. And then I went and I started learning drums. And I never really practiced what I was supposed to practice because I went and made sick beats. And then I started learning bass. And I think the biggest thing was that at that time, like, the time was just right for it to become my focus because of a whole bunch of other factors.
So how old?
Well, I started playing bass when I was about 13 years old.
Okay.
12 or 13 years old. But I, for a bunch of other reasons, all the energy and everything I was obsessed with sport, then suddenly I invested in music, and then I practiced bass, religiously on a technical level, and really did all the things I didn't do on the other instruments. Yeah.
So you just how did you get into bass? How did you find bass?
I was told to play bass.
So for once you did do what you're told.
Yeah, exactly. So I played piano, and I love harmony from that. And then I played drums. I love pocket from that. And then, like all little kids, I then wanted to play guitar. And obviously,
not everyone
my school teacher needed a bass player. So he said, "You know what, Pat? I've got just the instrument for you."
Did he?
No, he didn't. He didn't. That's another program. That's another time slot. Yeah, and he was like, "Okay, there's an instrument that's like more rhythmic than guitar, has more of a roll on a groove level, so it's kind of like the bass playing that you do. I mean, it's kind of like the drumming that you do."
Is that how you sold it to you?
Yeah, he was like, "It's like drums and piano. You combine those rolls together and you get bass." And so
I guess that's actually a pretty good description of your bass playing.
There's also an amazing rugby analogy for it. He was like, it's like the backs who are the fast ones and the forwards who are like the slow, strong ones. And it's like bass is like the halfback. It combines the... Anyway, you got to be into rugby to get it, but yeah.
Maybe some people are.
Yeah.
And was there anybody at that stage who was like a mentor or a teacher who you really...
Oh, yeah. Like I said, I don't know, I sent you that interview, right? The one I did do in India. I got interviewed in India when I was over there.
Oh, did you?
For the newspaper over there, yeah. And I ended up like talking about my teacher from school for ages because I just realised how huge influence he was for me. See, because like I was telling Sam before, like I actually was a terrible school student. Like I finished grade 12, but I didn't get a mark because I was kicked out of so many subjects. And if it wasn't for music, I'd probably be, I don't know, tagging a train somewhere or something.
Jazz man.
Yeah, exactly. It was this teacher that really got me on board, this guy called Anthony Dawkins, who lives in Melbourne, actually.
Okay.
Moved down here as a bass player, but now he's actually an architect. But he was just like this...
So you can afford to have a house and feed
Yeah. But he was just such an incredible all-round human that it made me really inspired, And his whole trip was, he was really into the Eastern philosophies, and he sort of applied that whole... like the Tao of archery, the Tao of, like this idea that if you practice something methodically enough and immerse yourself in it, it actually helps you spiritually as well. So that was my trip, because like, as you know, my family's very religious background. So for me, like, I took that on board and used that.
Music, you know, your faith.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was. I needed something because I wasn't really on board with all the other stuff.
Yeah.
So it really, for me, it's a really practice, especially practice.
Okay.
You know,
is that almost a meditative?
It used to be. I think I'm coming full circle because music actually is very scientific. You know, and a lot of like the postgraduate study and stuff I've done is all about the science of music and how it is actually a very rational thing. Like, obviously we have emotive responses to it. Am I talking too much?
No, it's your interview.
Okay. We have people have like an emotive response to it. So it can be a mystical experience for people or whatever, but I mean, music really can be, I mean, the harmonic series, rhythm, the logarithmic nature of our hearing, everything like that can be explained on a scientific level.
The nuts and bolts.
Yeah, and I think it should be. Like, it annoys me that that's not taught in music education.
So you're a Jeff Berlin?
No, because at the same time, I think that when something's executed properly, it should be still kind of, it needs to come back to the folk. It needs to be dirty.
I guess it's kind of like, I hate to use this analogy, but it's kind of like cooking, you know? There's a recipe book and there's like, you put this with this and X happens.
At the end of the day, it has to taste good.
At the end of the day, and that's up to the chef. That's how you combine it, how you...
Not just the chef, it's also up to, you know, the decor of the restaurant, the vibe, where you're eating it, the people you're with. And that's where I think, like, setting is really important. But at the end of the day, like, so just, you need... I think that what's awesome about music is that all that matters ultimately is how it's executed. You know, so, and that's where, not singling Jeff out in particular, but, you know, sometimes when you get academic, then it can sound academic. Whereas to me, yeah, sure, I like styles of music that other people might not like. Like, I love fusion and I love jazz and I love all that modern harmony. But in my opinion, the guys who are really good at that are good at it because it still ends up sounding like music. And that to me is something that comes from like a deeper folk kind of place, you know, like the best, you know, I don't know if you've heard that Branford Marsalis album Requiem.
No.
There's a track on that's in 15 and then 14, and it just goes between 15 and 14, and it's Jeff Tate and Watson drums, and you don't notice it at first because you're just like, this is slamming, and to me that's what,
you
know, that's when something's musical.
You know, like what, like, you know, I always think like, what have you got to say? You know, you've figured out your craft. Yeah. What do you have to say? Yeah. Some people just repeat things other people say. Some people have original thoughts.
For me, figuring it out on a scientific level really actually helped my craft. Like, I was already playing for like 15 years before I started to really think about it. Like, why is it an octave? Why, you know, I don't know, maybe other people learn that stuff straight away, but for me, like, it was only really, you know, later on that I started to go, wait a second, you know, why is it truly a universal language? And that's when I started looking into how our ears work and how the harmonic series really works and things like that.
And that followed you?
Yeah, it just for me, it
strengthened your foundation.
It helped me on a musical level, but it also helped me understand why it's important to persevere with this art, even when society doesn't go, we appreciate you. Yeah. You know, because
here's super at the end of your gig.
yeah, exactly. Because it's not, you know, unlike, you know, speech, unlike verbal communication, music isn't some sort of arbitrary set of symbols. You know, like, music at its core is a natural phenomenon. You know, it's the law of physics, and that's what makes it completely unique to other art forms. We're not saying, you know, a perfect fifth sounds almost as stable as an octave, it sounds almost as stable as a unison. Trust us. We're like, no, it actually does. Because of, you know, and to me that's an amazing thing that we're dealing with that as artists on the fly, you know.
So you're from Brisbane?
Yeah, I was born in Brisbane.
And then you studied?
Okay, yeah, so I was born in Brisbane, and I studied in Brisbane, and then in my 20s I moved to Melbourne for 6 years.
So what did you what did you study in?
So, yeah, like I said, when I was in high school, I hated institutionalised education. Yeah. Hated it. And just got by through by the skin of my teeth. Then sort of went to the Conservatorium of Music in Brisbane because I was told that that was the appropriate thing to do. So I sort of did it again begrudgingly. Was gigging more than I was studying, so I actually took a year longer to finish it because I just didn't show up to class because I was gigging. And then I moved down to Melbourne and I did postgraduate study.
What, did you move down for postgraduate or just?
I moved down for the scene.
Right.
Yeah, and then when I was down here, I started thinking more about my academic history and how I'd always done it sort of begrudgingly, and I thought, how would I go if I actually applied myself? So I sort of did it for a personal level just to kind of prove to myself that, I had the, cerebral power to actually, do well at it.
Yeah.
So I went and did this postgraduate thing at VCA. So I moved down here for gigs, for the experience, and then that was the first time I was exposed to actual academic writing, doing a thesis and things like that. Yeah.
And how did you find, moving to a new city as a musician?
I found, personally, because I moved back to Brisbane, and I didn't really mean to move back to Brisbane. It just sort of happened. And it made me reflect a lot on my time in Melbourne. For me, I've told you this before, I feel like there's lessons that I've only just now realised I learned. For me, my first love is improvising over functional harmony.
Yep.
So I love the jazz tradition. Basically, like the true essence of fusion. So I love pocket playing, I love grooves, I love great drummers, and I also love improvising over changes.
Yep.
And moving to Melbourne was the first time I got to do that on a weekly basis.
Yep.
I used to play at the Cape Live in the middle of Fitzroy there with Andy Sugg and Kate Kelsey Sugg and Nick Lamb, Kumar Shon, a bunch of Melbourne cats, Aaron Light, Aaron McCullough. And basically got my butt kicked for ages till I really, and it made me sit down with theory and really work on my harmonic knowledge. Really good from that point of view. An eye-opener, things that I didn't realise, at the time. We talk about this all the time, like acting off, being a goof, being a clown around people. Actually, you can't actually do that with everybody. And it's only Melbourne that taught me that.
Right.
Because some doors were not open that I thought were open.
Yeah.
People say to you, man, love your playing, would love to get a lesson sometime or whatever. But then you never get offered the gigs they're getting offered because you've failed a social test. Yeah. And that's a Melbourne thing, and it's probably all big cities where there's 10 times as many players as there are in Brisbane. Yeah. In Brisbane, I just feel like everyone's a lot nicer, but it's because, I think that there's, like I said, there's not the weight of industry, there's not the weight of, there's 50 guys all going for the same gig.
Yeah.
So there's not the added pressure to also be super cool. You know what I mean?
But you are super cool. So.
I am pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. As you can tell from the 20-minute answers I've given so far. Yeah. But I don't blame Melbourne. I think Melbourne's an awesome town. Yeah. I just think part of what I struggled with moving to a new city is just knowing how to keep my cards a bit closer to my chest.
Yeah.
I wanted everyone to, I'm very open and honest.
Yeah.
And I think especially in New York and places like that, part of it is probably about just
playing the game,
just being quiet, even Yeah. So it was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And so between studying and then Melbourne, what kind of gigs were you doing?
In Melbourne?
Just in general, were you doing just jazz gigs or cover gigs or cruise gigs?
Everything, man. Everything. That's always been my thing, is I just say yes to every gig. Yeah. There's certain gigs I've never really had to, my background is drums and piano. So for me, I need some sort of pocket and I need interesting harmonies, and I need one or the other. So a lot of those gigs where the bass is more texture, in terms of punk, really dirty grunge, heavy, that's not stuff that's ever really floated it for me. Okay. I've always liked stuff where I can hear the drummer and really sink into what he's doing. So whether it's sinking into his kick or his ride or whatever, that's my favourite context for parts. So I didn't do those gigs in Melbourne, but I did. So in Brisbane, I used to play a lot of Latin music, a lot of world music, and then a lot of covers. just paying bills, a lot of corporate stuff. And then when I moved to Melbourne, I was lucky. I got to do a little bit of session stuff, playing with did that thing with Bridget Pross and Peron Lamb, those guys. Playing the Brazilian choro music with Ollie Williams and those guys. No, they didn't really get into the salsa scene in Melbourne. Country, that Jetty Road gig and the tour, the world tour, that was the biggest sort of tour work I did was in the country thing. And then the fusion jazz thing with Andy Sugg and those guys. And then I was still always doing just the money-paying corporate slug gigs. And then teaching. Melbourne was the first time I really started teaching properly. Yeah.
And throughout your time in Melbourne, you were working on your composing and writing?
Well, I finished my album down here.
Yeah.
So the album was like a long, slow process because I'm not good with deadlines. I just, and I tend to write the way I improvise, which is like, I go in for method or whatever, but I only really put in the hard hours when I'm feeling it too. Mm-hmm. And that was the thing. So the album sort of was written in fits of emotional outpouring and late nights and because I compose in a computer environment, so I do a lot of production as well. Yeah. So I finished it down here, which surprised me because once again back in Brisbane where things are so much more easy, this album's not getting finished because I feel like things like that get finished when you're under the grind. Yeah. And
do you feel like the album is a good representation of
where I was?
It's
a good representation of where I was.
Okay.
My playing has improved a lot since I recorded that album. I think. I don't know what you think.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what an album should be. It should be like a date stamp of
where you were at.
Yeah.
I think it's. I get worried. Well, I try not to think about it, but sometimes I worry I won't be able to write an album like that again because I think that album was uniquely accessible. Like everyone I know who reviewed it or whatever. It's not an alienating amount of fusion or jazz, whatever. Whereas now I find it kind of hard or almost probably even dishonest to not bring that much language into it. You know? It was as much a producer's album as it was a player's album.
Yeah, there's lots of cool stuff on there. Talk about gear for a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Obviously, this isn't your.
This isn't my axe, no.
What is your axe?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, Craig. Let me tell you about my axe. You've never heard about my axe, have you?
No.
Yeah.
I need to know the exact millimeters on the 12th fret.
I could actually tell you.
I know.
So should I haven't looked at the camera once. I should be looking at the camera. MTD, Michael Tobias Design. And Daniel Tobias. Those guys are amazing. And so my main axe is an MTD, which I've actually I've got sort of custom electronics in that bass.
It's a 535?
It's a 535. At the moment I've had that bass for over 10 years. It's been played a lot, and I'm starting to consider maybe getting a 534, which is their 34-inch scale length, just because I play so much chordal stuff in my projects. And it's an amazing bass. It's a walnut cap. I mean, you can see it on, my channels and stuff.
Which is?
Well, the most popular one is PW Farrell's Bass Lessons, because there's bass lessons on there. And pwfarrell.com for all the other things. And brisbanebaselessons.com if you're in Brisbane and you want bass lessons. Also, I teach on Skype, not taking anything away from...
No.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But so MTD do amazing basses.
How did you arrive at MTD? Because it's not you can't really walk into a shop and try an MTD. That's the thing with a lot of my decisions
have been sort of
have late night bursts of
and it was a late night burst. It was so basically the first amazing bass I ever owned, which I still own, is a modulus graphite fretless. Yeah, and that's an amazing bass.
Was that also because a modulus graphite fretless? That's another thing you can't really just walk in.
That was the parents going, okay, if you're going to do this, do it for real.
Was that Jackal or Gary Willis inspired?
No, it was Anthony Dawkins, my teacher at the time, was on tour in Los Angeles. Yeah, and my parents had basically said to him, if you see an amazing bass, pick it up for our son. And he saw that and picked it up.
And it was fretless.
It was a fretless 5-string.
And you're like, Thanks.
I was like, oh man. Yeah, it's an amazing bass. So the dimensions of that bass influenced the fretted I wanted to get, because I had a few fretted basses since then, and none of them really were working as well as the fretless.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to get into fretted playing more because I wanted to explore harmony a lot more and not be influenced by the intonation aspect at all.
Yep.
And so based on the dimensions of that bass, it's 17mm bridge, 35 inch scale length. That's why I purchased the MTDs, because I just looked around, did a lot of listening, and they came, that scale length, and they weren't going to charge an exorbitant amount for putting a custom spacing on it. And I just sort of took a gamble and went for it.
I mean, MTD is not really a gamble, at the end of the day.
Yeah, but I mean, like in a lot of ways...
You play something you don't really know, right?
Yeah, but like I said, I put my custom... I customise the electronics, so I make them a bit darker than they are. The gospel chops zingy thing is kind of what they're known for, and that's not really what I'm trying to do or known for.
Yeah.
So I like to have the passive tone knob in there so I can get the darker thing.
Yeah. But you kind of only really customise all that stuff like halfway through. Because I remember when I was here last time, that was when you started changing it out. So you had it like stock for what, 5 or 6 years, or?
Well, yeah. I mean, I just figured out. I mean, it was just me problem solving.
Right.
It was like, okay, how do I make this feel more like my fretless without it being a fretless? And that's when I sort of was really looking into how some of my favourite players, like the Matt Garrisons, etc., get their sounds.
Yeah.
That's when I sort of discovered this idea of the passive tone knob.
Yeah.
It's a different approach to just rolling the trebles off.
Yeah.
It's like a different thing.
Yeah.
So I did a few things with that bass. Those guys were really nice. They let me change the neck on it. It originally came with a maple neck, and I sent it back and got a rosewood fingerboard put on it. And then I got the electronics with the passive. Yeah, and so that's why I'm interested now in looking into getting one that's a walnut body.
Right.
Because I think that's very interesting. Because at NAMM I played a few basses that were made of walnut, and yeah, they were amazing.
Yeah, it seems to be pretty popular wood now, or maybe it always has been, but it seems come to the forefront a bit more.
The thing that's hard with bass is that the character it takes on changes a lot in the mix, and it changes a lot as you get louder. And so from that respect, this classic scoop EQ is the safest, because it always works. Like, unless you got too many bottom and too much subs, but I go through that high filter thing. Unless you have too many subs, there's not much that can go wrong with kind of a scooped sound. As you get more of a present mid-range thing, it can be, when it's done perfectly, it's amazing. But the balancing act is very fine.
Yeah.
And it can end up sounding too boxy, know. And I think I've been talking to the MTD guys, and I think that's the danger of going full walnut, and wenge or wengy and all that stuff, is that as it gets too loud, it can, and that's why the sort of maples and the ash, are so popular, because they just work.
Yeah.
And so that's my reasoning, is like, okay, well, I've already got, my MTD has an ash body. Mm-hmm. It's essentially like a classic woods, except it's got a walnut cap. I've got that now.
Yeah.
And it's usable. I've been playing it for over 10 years. It's not like it's me being exorbitant. Now I want something a bit different,
But you've also experimented in the P bass, the jazz bass.
I love my P bass, man.
Yeah.
Like, so it depends on the scene. One thing I noticed about Melbourne is everyone plays a Fender. Like, everyone plays a Fender, and if you don't play a Fender, then you're not a real bass player. Which, if I had have lucked out and found one of those amazing vintage Fenders that you can set up like butter, then that'd be cool, but they're hard to find.
Yeah.
And so I really love a bass that plays like butter.
Yeah.
And for me, that's the MTD.
Yeah.
So I have my P bass, which I love because it just works. But I use it on gigs where that's really what I want.
Really required, yeah.
Yeah. In Brisbane, the scene's much more, everyone's playing different styles of music, and people don't really care if you show up with a 5-string or a 4-string. They don't judge you on your bass.
I think things have changed here.
Maybe. It's been 3 years now since I've been down here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See a lot of other stuff happening.
Well, I mean, there's just so much music in this town.
Yeah.
And I think Hiatus Coyote, all that happened after I left.
Yeah.
And I think the Hiatus Coyote thing has changed the perception of electric bass in this town.
Yeah.
And, also Lucas Taranto touring with Gautier, he was playing the, six-string Federa.
Yeah.
So, I mean, things are changing.
Yeah. Which is
definitely.
Yeah.
Apparently, Sydney's a lot more like that.
Yeah.
It's a lot more, people don't care if you show up with a 6 or 5 or whatever.
You're talking about, or you mentioned Matt Garrison.
I mentioned Matt Garrison. It's a pop song. In my opinion... It's Nickelback. Whoa! Anyway.
No, give us your whole list of influences.
Okay,
bass
obviously
song.
everyone says Jarko, and Jarko was a huge influence, but not for the same reasons that he was a huge influence on everyone else. For example, my favourite Jarko playing and my favourite Weather Report album is the one that's got a few names, Volcano for Hire. It's also called Record. It's the one where on the back of the album cover it's a picture of a person pressing a record button. It's a Weather Report album. It has that Dara Factor 1, 2, 3, 4, the New York City. Anyway, so Jarko and Weather Report. Jarko and Weather Report, huge influences.
I think for me, Jarko was more of an inspiration than an influence. Like, it was just like, okay, wow, that's a guy. It's just like a...
I mean, I forget sometimes how into Fretless I was. So there was definitely a time where... I mean, when I was a kid, man, I used to show up to covers gigs with Fretless. But I remember sitting up in the park up there in Brisbane outside South Rugby Club, in the park just with my bass and headphones and transcribing Jarko. So I definitely have been into Jarko.
Yeah.
Start at the beginning. Jamiroquai.
Oh.
Yeah, and Dig.
Zender and
Stuart Zender, Emergency on Planet Earth. That album.
Yeah.
And Dig, which is an Australian band, Directions and Groove. Amazing.
Who was the bass player's name?
Oh, I know his name. And Sam Dixon. Sam Dixon was his name. He actually taught a friend of mine. And then Brothers Johnson. And then Parliament Funkadelic. And then Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, album was given to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of this is Anthony Dawkins, my teacher, saying, okay, now check this out. Actually, my sister went to Poland and came back with this crazy mixtape of random funk, and I used to listen to that all the time too. And then, then Weather Report and Jarko.
Okay.
And then more... The reason why I don't go on about Jarko for ages is because actually a way bigger influence for me than Jarko was Gary Willis.
Yeah. And
Gary Willis, to me, is the most underrated bass player in the world. I mean, people know about him. Obviously, people say he's great, but I mean, I think he's way better than people realise. Gary Willis is...
He took fretless and just bass playing in general to...
Oh man! Have you ever tried to transcribe his stuff, or have you ever tried to read his lines?
I've tried to play one nightclub.
Mm.
Yeah, I remember my teacher at uni gave me nightclub, and that was kind of my first okay. Let's play Gary Willis, and I was just going, holy smoke! And it was quite slow and stuff, but it was just...
Oh, but but also his groove, his groove playing,
and his writing.
His writing, man, on Bent, that album is amazing. Speak, that track, Speak.
Yeah.
But Gary Willis has everything in his playing. He has all the chromatic 16th passing note stuff from Jameson.
Language.
Oh, but also the chromatic sort of
his groove playing down there.
Oh, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. He's the only dude I've ever met who I was starstruck in front of. Yeah. Because I got to go to NAMM last year and the year before, and I got to meet everyone, and then I met him and I was like, I love you.
Mate.
I love you. I want to be on you.
I have many bound books.
Yeah.
My bass smells.
So Gary Willis, huge influence. Yeah. And then the next person to really floor me after Gary Willis was Matt Garrison.
Yeah.
And same reason, sound. And then just as I was coming to terms with Matt Garrison, Hadrian Farrell, yeah, just punched me in the face brain. And it was really because of Hadrian that I started really getting into the four-finger thing more than Matt.
Four-finger thing being...
Well, I did it... I don't know if I can do it on your bass.
Oh, my bass isn't just...
Well,
Because
it's a very specific setup.
The ramp.
Yeah.
Was that when you got into the ramp as well?
Yeah, the ramp is definitely a part of that.
Yeah.
That whole thing. So once you play a bass that is set up differently, it is a different feeling. Also, I use pretty light strings at home, so it is different. But yeah, to answer your question, I sort of have never settled on one way to do these. I have a whole bunch of different things I do with my own 4-finger technique. So, so my way that I did it for ages was this weird mishmash of first finger, third finger, second finger, and then fourth finger. And that kind of came out of like a John Myung kind of like 3-finger kind of thing.
Yeah. Because Gary Willis is 3.
Gary Willis is a different trip again. Like the Gary Willis thing and the Matt Garrison flamenco thing are 2 different things.
But they're both 3-stroke, not rest stroke, or is Gary Willis rest stroke?
I think it's a combination of all of that. You know, like. I think Matt Garrison is more. Gary Willis is very rest stroke. He's very like he has this kind of this. I'm no expert on the way Gary does it, but the way he does it is. Hey,
you just said you're an expert on Gary Willis.
Well, but to me he's more palm muting. When I think palm muting.
Yeah, that stuff. Yeah.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
I was never one really to copy someone else's techniques because I always thought that my way was better. So
nobody can tell you what to do.
Yeah. So I always worked on my own techniques, and because as you know, I had the wrist problem and stuff, so I was very, very specific about how I played in particular. Yeah. But the main thing that's amazing about Gary Willis, we spoke about his groove stuff before, but also his complete original invention melodically when he's improvising. A lot of big name guys repeat themselves a lot when they solo. In the pursuit, perhaps, of intensity. Okay. But Gary Willis seems to, at least to me, I don't hear him playing a lot of repetition and reusing old licks and stuff, I think he's amazing. And then Matt Garrison. And Matt Garrison for me was a bigger influence on me technically. Well, although, like I said, all the palm muting stuff I got from Gary Willis. I'm using 2 fingers instead of just thumb and finger.
Yeah.
Whatever, I'm trying to do. I think then Hadrian's ridiculous, obviously. Yep. He's just got a bit of... He's Jarko 2.0 in the modern era, plus all the chordal stuff. And, it's just one of those dudes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about education. It is a bass lessons thing. And you are... What is your... how to phrase this? I guess, what would be your approach and emphasis in terms of fundamentals for players?
For me, I find if I'm left to my own devices and I just am freestyling, I naturally am inclined to connect with adults because I want to talk about the science behind it and I want to talk about all the reasons why, and then we go off and just do it. So I've actually put a lot of time and effort into creating my own syllabus so that doesn't happen. so that I can. I'm not really sure on the legalities of copyright stuff. I'd have to ask you about that actually. But I like to sort of teach kids where the natural notes are on the neck by showing them melodies, things like that.
Okay.
Just little things like that. So, because for me, let's just put aside the whole science behind it thing for a minute and just talk about the instrument.
Yeah.
For me, the most common thing with bass players is that they actually don't know the neck of their bass.
Yeah.
They don't know where the notes are.
Yeah.
So I spend a lot of time wanting to drill in the C major key center and just get people to actually know where the notes are on their instrument. You know, or alternatively doing it with a chromatic scale, but I just really need people to know where the notes are on their instrument. To me, that's such an overlooked thing.
And how do you map out your fingerboard?
Well,
I mean, how do you think you learned it?
See, this is where teaching is different to learning, because my way of learning at that time was very different to how a lot of students want to learn.
But also, I think a good teacher should be able to, because everybody learns differently. So I have students who are great with rhythm, show them it cool, and I have other students who struggle with it, and it's finding a way to connect with all your students.
Yeah.
And not necessarily bending them to your...
Well, I mean, that's a big philosophical discussion.
It's all the same
there's also a lot to be said for authentically and honestly doing what you do really, really well, and if that doesn't appeal to everybody, then there's other styles of teaching out there too. For me, like I said, I have a big syllabus, and that's how I sort of... I tend to find people, like you said, like some people... Like I've had students... I actually have a lot of students who are professional bass players, and, you know, the guys will come in and they'll have some weakness in their playing that they want to work on with me. But oftentimes it's borderline sharing, because then they'll have something else that they're really naturally great at.
Yeah.
You know, I always think times like that, like some people just have this amazing inner tempo, and they've never really had to sweat about it. Yeah. And then there's other players I know who are like world-renowned players who had to work on it really hard. Even Steve Gadd says in that in a famous drum video of his that it's constant adjustments, constantly adjusting, you know, the pocket and keeping on it. Yeah, but I mean, back to your question, I think that less information, for me, that's been the big lesson. Less information. Yeah. So just, you know, today we're only touching these two things, and we're going to touch them at whatever speed you need, like, so that you actually learn something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Reading success.
Yeah, and that really then has improved my connections with all styles of learners. Because one thing everybody wants, nobody wants to feel rushed or overwhelmed.
Exactly, yeah.
Occasionally I'll have a lesson where at the end of it I feel a bit guilty, and I'm like, man, I feel like I said too much. So I try to always have some visual component, whether it be just like a handout. What I do a lot actually is I have all my students on... So like I told you about the website, brisbanebaselessons.com, and there's a student portal. So we'll do the lesson and we'll talk about something, and I'll bring it up, and it won't be printed, it'll just be brought up on the computer and we'll talk about it. Yeah. And then I post it to the student portal.
To their own...
Well, I mean, you know, it's
just a behind the scenes thing, yeah.
It's a behind the scenes thing that you need a password to get into. Yeah. And then, you know, it's all contained there. To me, that's been a huge help, is like always making sure that I'm not just freestyling off topic. Like I need a visual thing.
You need it.
I need it, because I didn't learn the way other people learned. Yeah. You know, I learned with a real like hardcore mentality, like, you know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about.
And a lot of people don't want that.
Yeah, and I mean, how do you feel about, because obviously this is on YouTube, and there's that dichotomy where anything you want is on YouTube, but anything you want is on YouTube. It's like, it's a blessing and a curse, because it's kind of overloading for... I know almost every student I have is like, oh, I was watching this guy on YouTube, I was learning this song on YouTube, and it's kind of like, when we didn't have that when we were growing up, and I'm just wondering what kind of effect that's going to have on the next generation of...
I think it's already having an effect.
Yeah.
Like all these South American dudes that are showing up on Facebook, these amazing Brazilian bass players and stuff, I think it's already having an effect. And you know, in so many ways, like in terms of exposure, like I think it's lifted the game for everybody. Like I was talking to this with, you know, P-Rock the other day. It's like,
who's P-Rock?
Mark. Oh. Sorry. No, Mark Perrick and I were talking about this the other day, because it's like, you know, 20 years ago, if you went and did what, you know, a lot of us do, that was like before YouTube and stuff like that was you were then the guy. Like, wow, you can do that.
Yeah.
Whereas now you're compared to like the best. You know, and you know, you go to the NAMM show and it's like just tons of people who can do all, you know, everything.
Yeah.
You know, and it's been good for bass playing because I think you know, you have to actually go and make sure you're actually tapped into the tradition and not just shredding shapes, you know. Also, YouTube can be a blessing and a curse because, like, for me, the thing I personally am unsure about is whether to just cash in and just say, like, you know, here's you know, bass lesson, do boo do 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 do. Part of me feels like that's already out there.
Yeah.
So I want to have my own personality.
Yeah.
And so one thing I do is I like improvising and I also like production. So on the PW Farrell's Bass Lessons channel, I have been presenting this format where I do basically a remix or a rearrangement of a cover that might feature more than the bass line. It might feature soloing and chords. And then afterwards I give a lesson on it, and I give a lesson on some of the things I use plus how to play the original bass line. Now, 99% of the feedback's been positive, but then the negative feedback is so brutal. Like, it's like, you know, swearing in it and stuff, and like, and irrational. Like, I read it and I go, "You're an idiot." Like, I'm a professional bass player.
You can't take it seriously. You know?
Yeah, I don't play like this I'm doing this because for me, I had to find that kind of playing. Like, I had to find records where bass players soloed, and I had to, you know, I had to find that other thing. Because of my background, I didn't pick up the bass and think bass lines. I picked up the bass and thought, let's make music. And you know, when I put up videos of me soloing and playing chords, that's because I'm not playing in a band. You know, like, it's why, if I'm doing something creative, why would I want to watch a bass player by himself going, you know, like, there's a point where it's amazing and you're like, yeah, that's fat. But at the same time, I want to hear music. So when I'm doing the touring, like the blues thing, you know, I'll be playing my P bass and I'll, you know, play hardly anything, like, because that's the vibe.
The 1 and the 5, yeah.
Yeah. And to me, that's what an artist is, or a musician is, feeling out the context and responding to the context. Someone who can't respond to the context, to me, is kind of missing out. Like, this is just an instrument. It's an instrument. You can do whatever you want on this instrument. And when you play a pocket, when you play a part, it's got to be fat. If you're improvising and being creative, man, we've got 4 or more strings. There's no reason why you can't speak the same way a piano player or anyone else speaks. To me, that's not a no-brainer. I've never understood the idea of an instrument being defined by the name of the instrument. You know?
Yep. Or its perceived role.
But you better get it right. Because if you go in and you start finger tapping when everyone wants you to be supporting them, then you'll quickly have no work.
Yeah.
You know, and to me, I don't want to be like, I've never wanted to be one of these solo bass players who's like on stage with a looping pedal. Like, to me, that's the path of loneliness and long drinking binges. I like making music with people.
With people, yeah.
Yeah, and so, you know, if you're going to improvise on bass, you need to create a context where that is giving to the context and not taking away from the context.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means arrangements. Sometimes that means having a keyboard player who'll lay a fat pad beneath you. Sometimes it means, you know, making sure you're playing in a jazz setting where, you know...
Do you think you're, like, you're having produced your own album, do you think your production skills or having that mentality helps in terms of thinking where you sit and whatever musical context you're
I think so. I think because I play a lot, I have...
You play a lot, or you really play regularly?
Because I always have the instrument in my hands.
Yeah.
In the past, I have finished a gig and I thought, wait a second, no, I got too inside. I've had to work on trying to get outside of my bass player.
Get outside of your head.
Yeah. And you know, and part of that's from, I think I've gotten better at that from hearing other people get it wrong.
Okay.
You know, and being on stage with someone, and then you're like, no, that solo should have ended like 2 choruses ago. Like,
yeah,
you know, or seeing other bass players and be like, oh, you know, and maybe I think I went through that phase. But at the same time, you know, I think you also, like, say with my Jackal project, like, if it's a legitimate jazz project or something like that, I think you need to also fight for that as well. Like, you shouldn't be stressing about, you know, people not understanding that this is complex music and, you know, in the right setting. But if you're getting paid to be a bass line player, then you're playing bass lines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was the question?
I don't know. Sorry, soz.
That's all good. I reckon that's probably about the other one. I think.
Yeah.
We've noted out a lot of different things.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is there anything you wanna impart?
Oh, there's so much I have to say. In January, I was really lucky. I got to go to Calcutta and play at the guitar festival there. And it was, I remember I used to have this sort of, I used to imagine all the time, what would happen if I went, you know, to an alien planet and all their IQs were double our IQs? What sort of music would they listen to? Or would it just be beep, pop, beep, brrr, beep, pop, beep, beep, and then everyone's like, and then all hits at 1001, you know. And so I was in India at this thing, and I was going to these classical Indian concerts, and Indian music's different to Western music in that Western music's cadences really hinge on the harmony, like a 5-to-1 harmonic cadence, whereas Indian music's strongest cadence is a rhythmic cadence, which is T high, which is essentially a phrase where the last note of the phrase ends on the top of the rhythmic cycle. But the phrase has to consist of 3 phrases of equal length. You know? Daga 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 1, that sort of thing. Daga 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 1, 2, 3, 4. But they'll do, you know, way longer.
Yeah.
And, you know. So, you know, you'll be watching this concert and it's like a slow, what we would call a slow 7/4 or something, and there's things like building and you're sort of getting lost in the rhythm, and then suddenly everyone starts applauding and you're like, what the crap is going on? And then you realise it's these massive long rhythmic cycles and everyone's been following it, and they've all been sitting there counting, little old ladies, little kids, right? They're all sitting there counting along, and, you know, even if it takes 5 minutes to resolve, they're all hip to it.
Rhythm king.
Oh man. And you know, I gained a deeper insight into just how much important art music has been marginalised in Western society, especially in Australia, right, but in Western society in general. Because, like I said, you know, we're talking about complex stuff in India.
Yeah. Music
over there isn't a distraction. It's not something you sort of do next to the pokies and next to... Pokies is Australian for slot machine. It's not something that you do as a distraction. It's something, you know, if you become a leading musician over there, you get given a new title, like the essence of becoming a knight, you know. And so for me, that was very eye-opening. Okay. And I think that if you're going to be a professional musician who actually cares about art music, cares about the kind of music that you need to improve constantly through your whole life, the fire has to come from within you if you're in the West, because it's not coming from the public.
Yeah.
And we can try to convince ourselves that there's some sort of art in playing pop music and that it's... Man, I'm sorry, but if you want a lifelong pursuit, that's a rewarding lifelong pursuit, where you actually do improve your whole life and you do actually need to practice, and then it's beyond the realm of pop-friendly radio music. Like, there's just so much to be learned holistically, you know, from art music, from jazz and from improvised music and classical. There's so much more than what 90% of us have to play to get paid. So that fire has to come from within you. I'm not saying that there aren't amazing session players playing pop music. I'm not denouncing that at all. Like, guys like Neil Stilbenhouse, I idolise. But what I'm saying is there's so much more, and it makes you a more in whole person. You know, if you start really pushing the boundaries with your music it makes you a better groove player. I believe that. You know, these guys who don't have any understanding of the fretboard and don't do anything beyond playing the groove lines, and then they say, "Oh, I'm just a groove player." I'm like, are you really? Like, what happens if the singer wants to do the song in upper tritone? Like, are you still a groove player or are you a tab player? You know, like, music is a language. It's a language. It's the most ancient language. So learn to speak music.
Pretty good, man.
Yeah, man. Rock et roll. We should try to hit our rings and then we could...
Alright, see you next time.
BrisbaneBassLessons.com